We are all familiar with technologies today that we didn't use or even know about just a few years or decades ago. Surround sound, streaming, or even self-driving cars. All three of these technologies are much older than most people probably think. And that's true for many other technologies as well. I want to present some of these technologies, and in this episode I start with technologies from the category of home entertainment. The technology surround sound doesn't seem so new anymore. Since the introduction of the DVD, the number of surround sound systems in living rooms has increased more and more. Since the 80s, amplifiers were also offered that could play VHS tapes in analog Dolby Surround. This seems to be the beginning of surround sound for home entertainment, because before that it was only available in cinemas. And this is exactly how it is often found in texts on this topic. But that is completely wrong. In the early 70s, marketing began for a surround sound format for music, quadraphonic sound. It was designed for home use and could be played back from tape, 8-track cartridges and vinyl records. Music in quadraphonic sound is played over 4 speakers, 2 in front of the listener and 2 behind the listener, creating an acoustic circle. In principle, this is exactly the same as today's 5.1 surround, except that there is no subwoofer and center channel, which are both actually unnecessarily for the circle. Back then, mixing in surround was done completely differently than we are used to today from movies and even sometimes from music. Today, the acoustic action takes place almost exclusively in the front, and the surround channels provide reverb, background sounds, and a few effects here and there. In the 70s, all instruments, singers, and so on were spread around the listener. Listening to quadraphonic recordings is very impressive and immersive, and there are a lot of really great albums in quadraphonic sound. The most famous, of course, is Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, but there are many others in this format as well. Deep Purple, Chicago, Johnny Cash, Jim Croce, Sly and the Family Stone, Mike Oldfield, Santana, and many more. However, the format did not succeed and disappeared already at the end of the 70s. But quadraphonic sound is one of the reasons why surround sound became generally established in cinema. In the 70s, there was a problem. A vinyl record can actually only store 2 channels, meaning stereo, and not 4. The problem was solved with 2 completely different methods. One is called matrix quadraphonic. How this works exactly would go much too far at this point, maybe in another video. Anyway, with matrix quadraphonics you can store 4 channels in only 2 and decode them during playback so that 4 channels are reconstructed. But the channel separation suffers from this, because over each channel you also hear something from at least 2 other channels. This makes it a bit more difficult to localize sounds precisely in space. It is exactly this method, matrix quadraphonic, that Dolby adopted in the mid-70s for cinema. The first film to use this new format, Dolby Stereo, was A Star is Born in 1976, and many more quickly followed, like Star Wars in 1977. But the 2 additional channels were used differently here. One channel was used as a center channel between the 2 front speakers to keep dialogues more stable in the center for the viewer, no matter where you were sitting in the cinema. The other channel was played back over several speakers behind the audience and so used for surround effects. You already know the rest of the story. With VHS and surround receivers, this format then came back into the living rooms in the 80s, where it actually began. Today's home video game consoles all have the ability to download games over the internet. That's also not so new anymore. You might think this started after 2000 or maybe in the 90s. No. The first service that made it possible to download games via a game console officially launched in 1981. In late 1979, Mattel launched the Intellivision game console. It quickly became a really strong competitor for the well-known Atari 2600. Before the Intellivision was even released, Mattel developed a service with General Instrument that would it make possible to download games with the new console, PlayCable. But it's not just the early date that is special. Also, the transmission path is special because the connection for downloading wasn't realized by a telephone line. To use PlayCable, the special PlayCable adapter was inserted into the cartridge slot. The PlayCable adapter was then connected to the cable TV port. A signal was permanently transmitted by the cable provider at the frequency of 107.7 MHz, which contained a program with a catalog of games. When the console was switched on, it automatically loaded the program into the console via this frequency and displayed the catalog on the TV. You could now choose from 15, later from 20 games. Every month the game selection was updated. If you selected a game with the controller, the console switched to another frequency on which the program code of the selected game was permanently broadcast. The code was loaded into the internal memory of the PlayCable adapter and then the game started. The idea of using cable TV to run the service is kind of clever. At that time, there was no Wi-Fi or anything like that, and a phone connection is in depth not near the TV where the game console is located. However, the way via cable TV is also the reason why you could only use the services in selected areas, because each cable provider had to use the computer itself, which broadcasts the program codes on the frequencies. The company Control Video Corporation started a similar service for the Atari 2600 2 years later in 1983, GameLine. But here the connection was made over telephone line. This made a few other features possible because the transmission could now go both ways. For example, you could upload high scores to the service's central computer. But in the same year, a development began that is known today as the video game crash of 1983. Both services, PlayCable and GameLine, were also discontinued for this reason in the same year. It wasn't until 1988 that such a service was available again for a game console, namely for the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was called Family Computer Network System and also worked via the telephone line. However, the idea of providing such a service via a TV connection was actually picked up again. Sega operated the Sega Channel service via cable TV from 1994 to 1998 in the USA, and in Japan there was the Satellaview service for the Super Nintendo from 1995 to 2000, which could be received via satellite TV. Streaming services are omnipresent today. When it comes to music streaming, the time travel goes back a long way. Even those who don't use a special service today can at least search for a music title via YouTube and, in most cases, play it directly. It's hard to imagine that something like that would be possible without the internet, but that is exactly what has been done. And it was already done in the beginning of the 20th century. Ever heard of the Theatrophone? This was a system that allowed you to listen to live operas and theater performances over telephone. It was developed by Clément Ader and introduced in Paris in 1881. The special feature, the transmission was in stereo, by 2 telephone handsets. At that time, the term stereo didn't actually exist and the possibility of recording in stereo hadn't been invented yet. But the Theatrophone is not directly related to music streaming because it was live broadcasting. So as a user, you couldn't wish for a certain track to be played back immediately. But the principle of music transmission via telephone line became very popular all over the world. And there was a special variation in the USA. George R. Webb invented a service that he first demonstrated in Baltimore in 1908 and officially launched in Wilmington, Delaware in 1909. Telmusicki. And this service is definitely a kind of music streaming service. As a subscriber, you got a directory of records that were in Telmusic's library. You could now call the service from your own living room by phone and ask for a specific track. In Telmusic's central office, the so-called music room, the requested record was then looked up. Meanwhile, the subscriber connected a special loudspeaker to the telephone line at home. At the central office, the record was then placed on a free record player and the music was transmitted over the telephone line. In 1914, Telmusic was discontinued. The basic idea of playing records on demand over the telephone line was picked up again. For example, in 1939 with the Multiphone by Kenneth C. Shivers. But the Multiphone cannot be classified as home entertainment. It was a system that was installed in restaurants, cafes and bars. There was a device at the table into which you could insert a coin. You were then connected by telephone to a central office in Seattle, and your music request was transmitted in the same way as in case of Telmusic. Because you couldn't use the service in your own living room, but only in bars and places like that, the function of the Multiphone and similar services doesn't really have much in common with today's music streaming, but more with jukeboxes. Surround sound, downloads via game consoles, and music streaming. 3 present-day home entertainment technologies that appeared significantly earlier than you might have thought. Such invention seems as if they came from an alternate timeline where technologies were created earlier than in our own. The only difference is that they don't come from such an alternate timeline, but from our reality.